Welcome back everyone to another night of terror. In today's video, we're diving into 3 chilling true horror stories that take place after midnight, when the world is quiet but the darkness hides secrets far more terrifying than we could imagine. These stories are straight from the shadows, where things that go bump in the night are far from just figments of imagination. But before we begin, I want to thank each and every one of you for your incredible support. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions make this channel possible, and we're so grateful for your presence in our growing community. Stay safe, take care of yourselves, and prepare for some spine-chilling moments. Let's begin. Story 1: The Haunted Farmhouse. The farmhouse has always been too large. I never realized it before, not when we first moved in. Back then, it was merely a refuge, a place where I could shut the door against the world, where I could hold on to her, keep her close. But now it seems like a vast expanse of nothingness, a hollow shell filled with echoes, creaks, and the incessant hum of a silence that has no end. I'm not sure when the house stopped being merely a house. I'm not sure when it began to feel like something more, something alive, or perhaps something that had always been there, lying dormant, waiting. But I knew one thing for certain: the farmhouse had become a place of endless, suffocating grief, and with it, the strange occurrences began. They didn't come all at once. No. At first they were subtle, small things, easily overlooked. But as the days wore on, those small things became unbearable. The house that had once felt warm and full of life was now a dark, haunted place, echoing with memories I could never escape. It started the first night after she died. I should have been exhausted, I suppose, drowned by grief, by the weight of it all. But instead, I lay wide awake in the silence, hearing the wind outside scraping against the window pane like an incessant, gnawing sound. The darkness inside the room pressed in on me, wrapping around me, making me feel like I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just the quiet of the house, but something else, a thick, heavy silence that felt alive, as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting for something. I had buried her just a day ago, and yet, as I lay in that bed, our bed, the bed we shared for so many years, everything felt wrong. There was something in the house, something that shouldn't be there, but it wasn't the kind of thing you could point to or name. It was just there, creeping beneath the surface of my thoughts, coiling into the very foundation of this place. And then that was when I first saw it, the shadow in the window. I didn't want to believe it at first. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that it was nothing, just the wind, the shifting of the trees outside. But when I stared at the window, the shape remained. It moved, a dark blur, unnatural. It wasn't the way the branches of the trees moved in the wind, not like any shadow I had ever seen before. I stood frozen, staring at it, feeling an icy chill spread through me. My heart pounded in my chest, too loud, too frantic. I told myself to breathe, to look away, but my eyes wouldn't leave the window. Something was there, something real, something I couldn't explain. I tried to get up. I needed to check just to prove to myself that it was nothing. But when I crossed the room, my feet felt like they were dragging through thick, invisible mud. I reached for the door, my hand trembling as I turned the knob. The room seemed to close in on me. The walls felt too close, too suffocating, and I could hear my breath too loud in the stillness. I opened the door. The room was empty. Of course it was. There was nothing there. Just her things hanging quietly in the closet, as if she were still here, still somewhere, just out of reach. I looked at the window again. Empty. The shadow was gone, as if it had never existed at all. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm my breathing, trying to tell myself that I had imagined it, that I was just grieving, losing my mind in the depths of my sorrow. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, something or someone that didn't belong. The days passed in a haze, each one blending into the next like the fog that rolled in off the fields in the early morning. I had tried to distract myself, to keep busy, but no matter what I did, no matter how much time I spent in the workshop, or how many times I tried to focus on mundane tasks, the house wouldn't let me forget. It watched me. It waited. And then the footsteps started. It began small, a light tapping, barely audible. At first I thought it was just the house settling. The old beams creaked. The floorboards shifted. But then it came again, louder, distinct, like someone walking through the room above me, someone who should not have been there. I froze, my heart beating wildly in my chest as I listened. The footsteps echoed through the empty halls. Slow, deliberate. They didn't stop. I couldn't bring myself to go upstairs right away. I don't know why. Maybe I was afraid of what I would find, or maybe I was afraid of what I wouldn't find. But eventually I gathered enough courage to go up there. The steps creaked beneath my feet as I ascended the stairs, and each sound seemed to echo in the hollow emptiness of the house. I reached the landing. The door to her room was ajar. Inside, the room was just as I had left it. The bed still made, the curtains still drawn, and yet the air felt wrong, thick. The silence seemed heavier, like something was pressing in from all sides. The room had shifted. It had become strange, unfamiliar. I couldn't place it, but I felt the change deep in my gut. I opened the closet, hoping to find something, anything that would explain it. But there was nothing. Just the clothes she had worn, hanging neatly in their places, as though she had only just stepped out for a moment. Her scent still clung to the fabric, a bitter reminder of her absence. That night, the footsteps returned. Louder this time. I could hear them clearly now, distinct, heavy, as though someone was pacing in the room above me, walking back and forth, back and forth. I wanted to call out. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. I lay there, frozen in bed, the darkness pressing against me, the footsteps never ceasing. I called the police. What else could I do? I was alone. No one would understand what was happening. I needed someone to tell me it was just my imagination, just the grief warping my mind. They came, checked every door, every window, every lock. They found nothing. No sign of an intruder. No sign of anyone entering the house. They left without a word. Just like the shadow in the window. Just like the footsteps above me. Nothing was ever explained. The kitchen lights were next. The first time it happened, I thought I had left them on. But I hadn't. I was sure of it. I had turned them off before I went upstairs. Yet when I came down that night, they were blazing bright and harsh against the dark. I went to check the switches. Of course, they were all in the off position, and yet the lights remained on. I tried to make sense of it, rationalize it, but nothing made sense anymore. The house had become something else, something I couldn't control, something that watched me. A few nights later, I found her clothes on the floor again. Her blouse, the one she had worn the last time we were together, was crumpled and discarded as though someone had been through the closet rummaging through her things. But I hadn't done it. I hadn't touched anything. It didn't make sense. I couldn't make sense of it. That's when I saw her. The woman. She was standing in the doorway just beyond the threshold, her face obscured by the shadow. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was rooted in place, watching as she stepped forward, disappearing into the dark. I couldn't sleep after that. I couldn't eat. I couldn't think. The house had become my prison, and I couldn't escape it. Every night, I heard the footsteps. Every night, the kitchen lights flickered. And every night, I saw her, the woman, always just out of reach, always fading into the shadows before I could fully understand what she was. I don't know when it happened. I don't know when I stopped being myself, when I stopped trying to make sense of it all. All I know is that now I wait. I wait for the footsteps to return, for the lights to flicker, for her to appear again, standing just beyond my reach. And I know deep down that there is no escape from the house, no escape from my grief, no escape from her. Story 2: The Strange Encounter at McDonald's. The air outside was thick with something indefinable, something cold and waiting. The night had stretched itself too thin, as though it were about to break open. I don't know what I expected, but it certainly wasn't this feeling that the world had somehow turned off like a machine left to idle in the dark. There was a stillness to the night that I could feel pressing against my skin, an oppressive heaviness that made every breath feel like a violation of the silence. I had finished my shift at McDonald's, the last of the empty cups discarded into the trash, the faint stench of grease hanging in the air like an afterthought. Nothing had stood out during the shift. It was the usual. The usual faces, the usual orders, the usual mind-numbing repetition of it all. But now, as I stepped outside into the parking lot, there was nothing usual about the air. The night had twisted somehow, as if the world had shifted just enough to make me feel wrong in it. The parking lot was empty save for the occasional hum of distant streetlights. I locked the door behind me and moved toward my car, each step a faint echo against the asphalt, as though the sound were too loud in the stillness. It was the kind of quiet that made you question whether you were truly alone or simply being watched. That's when I saw it. A Volkswagen, sitting alone in the farthest corner of the lot, parked at an unnatural angle as though it had been positioned with intent. Its dark, glossy surface gleamed under the dim light, reflecting back the emptiness of the world around it. It seemed so out of place in the stillness, as if it belonged to another world entirely, one I wasn't a part of. I stared at it for a moment, something stirring inside me, an uneasy sensation creeping up my spine. It was the kind of feeling you get when you realize something is wrong but can't pinpoint what it is. I glanced around, no one else in sight, no other cars. No sounds, just the hum of that distant street lamp and the growing weight of the silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that the car was waiting for something, waiting for me. I hurried to my car and started the engine, trying to push the unsettling thought away. It was just a car, I told myself. Just a Volkswagen, an ordinary thing left abandoned in a parking lot. But even as I drove away, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, the shape of the car still looming in the background, a shadow hanging over me. The feeling lingered, unsettling, almost suffocating, as though I was being followed, though there was no sign of anyone behind me. It was just my mind playing tricks, right? The drive to the nature preserve was longer than it should have been. The road stretched out ahead, and the trees on either side seemed to bend toward me, like dark figures that followed my every movement. Their branches clung to the edge of the road like dark fingers, and I couldn't shake the sense that they were reaching out, pulling me in, trying to guide me somewhere I didn't want to go. I turned onto the narrow road that led to the preserve, my headlights flickering over the gravel. The air felt even colder now, a bite to it that made my skin prickle. When I parked in the lot, the silence seemed even more complete, like the night had folded in on itself. I killed the engine, but the quiet pressed in harder, so much harder, suffocating. There was nothing here, nothing except the dark outline of the trees and the quiet hum of my own breathing. And then, again, I saw it. The Volkswagen, sitting in the same corner of the lot. How could it be here? How had it gotten here before me? It was impossible. I hadn't seen it when I turned in, but now it was there, parked exactly where I had parked, as if it had materialized out of thin air. The same dark car, the same gleaming surface, reflecting back the cold emptiness of the lot. It felt like the world was pressing in on me, a moment stretched too thin, stretched too tight. Something was wrong, something had gone wrong. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing. I glanced around the lot. No other cars, no lights. Just the Volkswagen in the trees. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick with something I couldn't name. I wasn't alone. I wasn't alone. And then, just as I was about to get out of the car, the headlights of another car flashed into view, cutting through the dark like a knife. It was Sebastian. His car slowed to a stop beside mine, and I watched him get out, his figure lit briefly by the glow of his headlights. He didn't seem to notice the Volkswagen at first, but I could feel the tension in the air, the way it hung between us like a spider's web waiting to ensnare us both. "Everything okay?" he asked, glancing at me. His voice seemed distant. "I don't know," I replied, my voice sounding small even to me. I forced a smile, though it felt as if it were a mask I had to wear to stop myself from crumbling. "Weird, right?" "Yeah," he muttered, eyes still fixed on the Volkswagen. "I noticed it on the way in. That car is off." The air between us thickened again. The unease I had been feeling earlier started to press in on both of us now. It wasn't just the Volkswagen. It was everything, the way the trees seemed to lean in closer, the way the dark wasn't quite as dark as it should be. The feeling of being watched. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone, something, was waiting in the shadows, waiting for us to make a wrong move. That's when they appeared. 4 men. Emerging from the dark like specters, their movements fluid, unhurried, as though they were not a part of the world but something that had slipped through its cracks. They walked toward us slowly, without speaking, their presence hanging in the air like a foul odor that clung to everything. The leader of the group, a tall, gaunt figure, approached with a strange smile on his lips. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile that made my skin crawl. "Hey," he said, his voice a quiet rasp, "you guys wanna hit this?" He extended his hand, holding a blunt between his fingers, offering it like it was the most casual thing in the world. But his eyes never left us. They were cold, lifeless, like the eyes of something that no longer cared about what was human. Sebastian looked away, his expression unreadable. I couldn't speak. I could only watch as the men stood around us, their movements slow, deliberate, as though they were circling prey. "What are you doing here?" I asked, the words falling from my lips before I could stop them. It was a stupid question, an invitation for them to say something cryptic, something that would make me feel even more out of place. One of the men chuckled, but it was a hollow sound, like the noise an empty bottle makes when it's dropped. "Just passing through," he said, but his words seemed wrong. They didn't fit. You know, the usual. Well, I didn't know. And I didn't want to know. The others stood by, silent, unmoving. And that's when I noticed it, the 4th man, the one who had been hidden in the trees. His presence had always been there, lurking just at the edge of the shadows. Now he stepped into the light for the first time, and I saw that he was holding something small, something that could have been anything. But the way he clutched it, the way his fingers curled around it, tight and unnatural, made my stomach drop. Sebastian stiffened beside me. "We need to go," he whispered. But his voice was shaking now. Before I could respond, the men began to move toward us, their movements sudden, violent, a shift from the detached, empty interaction we had shared to something more predatory. We ran. The sound of our footsteps echoed in the parking lot, but it wasn't enough to drown out the sound of theirs, their slow, deliberate steps, the crunch of gravel under their feet. They were closing in, drawing closer with every passing second. I didn't dare look back as I fumbled for my keys, my hands trembling, my pulse a frantic drumbeat in my ears. Finally, I managed to unlock the door and jump into the car, slamming it into gear, the engine roaring to life. I glanced in the rearview mirror as I pulled away, the headlights cutting through the night, and I saw them standing in the parking lot. The Volkswagen was gone. The men were gone. But the feeling, that sense of something following, something lurking just beyond the light, that stayed with me. It stayed with me the entire drive home, the silence of the night pressing down on me like a weight, the shadows stretching long in the corners of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still there watching me, waiting for me. I couldn't escape it. And deep down, I knew. I wasn't meant to. Story 3: A McDonald's Nightmare. I returned to the McDonald's the next day, though I could not quite understand why. The impulse was not a conscious decision, it felt more like an instinctual pull and itch in the back of my mind that I could not scratch. Something had happened the day before. I could still feel the prickling tension of the encounter in the parking lot, the lingering dread of the two men whose eyes had followed me and Sebastian with such an unsettling intensity. I had to know more. And yet at the same time I had no desire to be here, in this place filled with the faint odor of grease and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. It was as if this McDonald's, this very spot, had become an anchor to something darker, something I could no longer shake, no matter how far I tried to walk away from it. Sebastian had agreed to come with me, though I knew he didn't want to. His reluctance was evident in his stiff posture, the way he held himself in the passenger seat as we drove in silence. I could see the unease in his eyes, the same unease I had been carrying since we'd first locked gazes with those men. But we both knew that we were already too deep into this, too far gone to simply walk away now. We had entered this world, and it wasn't one we could easily leave. We arrived at the restaurant. The parking lot was almost completely empty, save for a single car parked at the far end, its windows tinted so dark I could barely make out its shape. The space was quiet, too quiet, as if the world had forgotten to breathe in this particular corner of existence. The sound of the wind stirring the leaves outside was the only thing that broke the eerie silence. Even the sky above was a dull, oppressive gray, as though the clouds themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I pushed open the door and a soft bell tinkled overhead, but it sounded like a distant chime, muffled as though it came from a place too far away to be truly heard. The restaurant, normally bustling with the sound of customers, was almost completely empty. Only a few scattered tables were occupied by people who barely looked up as we walked past them. Their faces were drawn, their gazes vacant, as though they were trapped in some repetitive loop of tiredness and disinterest, as if nothing could hold their attention for long enough to matter. The smell of greasy food, once a mundane and comforting scent, now felt invasive, like it was seeping into the walls and suffocating everything around it. I spotted the woman behind the counter. She was in her early 20s, perhaps, though her demeanor suggested she had lived far longer than that. Her face was tired, her eyes hollow with a sadness I couldn't quite place. She moved with a deliberate slowness, each motion calculated, as though even the simple act of preparing food had become a tedious, soul-crushing task. When she saw us approaching, she did not greet us. There was no cheery welcome to McDonald's, or can I take your order? Her gaze flicked over to us, but it was brief, detached, more like an observation than an invitation. I placed the photograph on the counter in front of her, a simple gesture, but one that felt like an irreversible step. The grainy image of the two men, the ones from the parking lot, was now out in the open. I couldn't take my eyes off it. She glanced at the photograph, her fingers brushing over the faded image of the two men. The action was slow, deliberate, as though she had done this 1,000 times before, like she was tracing the edges of a memory she could not escape. She said nothing for a long moment, just stared at the picture, her eyes distant, as if searching for something in the image that was beyond the men themselves. Finally, her lips parted, and her voice came out in a flat, mechanical tone, devoid of any emotion. "That's him," she said, almost absently. Her eyes never left the photo, and for a moment I wondered if she had even heard me. "Used to work here." The words hung in the air, as though they had been waiting, poised on the edge of her lips, to fall into place. "Used to work here." It was a phrase that seemed so simple, yet carried with it an undercurrent of something far darker. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to remain calm, to press further. I needed more than just those words. I needed to understand. "Used to," I repeated, my voice sounding more hollow than I had intended. She nodded, her gaze flicking briefly to me before settling back on the image in front of her. "Yeah, he was fired." Fired. The words settled into my chest like a lead weight. Fired. But that didn't explain the rest. It didn't explain the unsettling tension I had felt when I looked at those men. It didn't explain why I felt as though something about all of this was far from ordinary. Why I asked, though I already knew I didn't want to hear the answer. Her fingers curled slightly around the counter, her knuckles going white, as though the question itself had stirred something inside her. She hesitated for a long moment, her eyes flickering to the door, as though she was scanning the outside world for something or someone. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke again. He stalked someone, she said, her words falling from her lips like stones. A woman who worked here. He followed her everywhere, even after she left, even after they told him to stay away. The word stalk seemed to vibrate in the air around us, filling the space with its heavy, suffocating presence. The meaning of it curled around my thoughts, and suddenly the room seemed to shrink. The sounds of the restaurant, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the low murmur of voices became distant, distorted, as if the world outside this conversation had ceased to exist. I could see it now, the image of the man standing in the parking lot, watching, waiting. He hadn't been a stranger. He hadn't been an accident. He had been someone who had known exactly what he was doing. The woman's voice lowered even further, barely audible now. He kept coming back, she murmured, her gaze now fixed on something far away, something I couldn't see. Every day, just standing there, watching, waiting. I shivered, the air around me turning suddenly cold. I had come here looking for answers, but instead I felt as though I had unlocked something that had been buried too deep for me to fully comprehend. The sense of wrongness, of intrusion, grew stronger, thicker. I wanted to leave, but the pull of the place, of the conversation, kept me rooted to the spot. Is he still here? I asked, though I could already feel the answer in my bones. The woman's eyes flickered to the door once more, a slight tremor in her hands. Maybe, she said, her voice cracking slightly. Maybe he's gone now. Maybe not. But I knew. The answer was already written in the way the air felt thick and expectant. He was still here. He had never truly left. I didn't need to hear more. The weight of the woman's words, the weight of everything that had been revealed, was too much to carry. It was as if the very air in the restaurant had become toxic, tainted with the presence of something far darker than I had ever imagined. My mind raced, but I couldn't keep up with it. The sense of dread that had begun to curl in my stomach now grew to a gnawing, insistent ache. We left the McDonald's without another word, stepping into the parking lot, though the world around us felt like it had shifted somehow. It wasn't just the restaurant, it was everything. The trees, the buildings, the air itself. It all felt off, as though some invisible force had twisted everything into something alien. The silence of the parking lot was more pronounced now, louder in its absence, and I could feel his eyes on me. I didn't need to turn around to know he was there. He was always there, watching. Sebastian walked beside me, but he was distant, his face pale. He didn't speak. None of us spoke. We didn't need to. The feeling was mutual. We were trapped in something far beyond us, something we could not escape. The parking lot, once a place of routine and mundane familiarity, had become something else entirely. We didn't look back. But I knew that no matter how far we walked, he would be there somewhere just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting, always waiting. As we come to the end of today's video, we want to thank each and every one of you for joining us on this terrifying journey through 3 true horror stories that unfolded after midnight. We hope these stories left you with chills and a sense of unease, reminding us all of the darkness that lingers when the world falls silent. Your support means everything to us. Thank you for liking, commenting, and subscribing. It's your engagement that allows us to keep bringing you these spine-tingling tales. Stay safe, take care of yourselves, and remember, the scariest things often happen when the clock strikes midnight. Until next time, we'll see you in the next video.